Hello everyone, my name is Stefanie Kalli and this is Chapter 8 of our endocrinology course. In this presentation we will be talking about the endocrinology of the cardiovascular system and the kidney. That means we will be mentioning all the hormones that affect these systems as well as how do they affect them. On this slide you can find the chapter objectives of Chapter 8 of endocrinology. There are 6 of them. On this video we will discuss the first 4. Then on the next video we will discuss number 5 and number 6. That means that in this video we will be discussing hormones secreted and acting on the cardiovascular system and on the kidney, and on the second video we will be discussing the clinical correlate, that is endocrine responses in heart failure, and some revision time which will include questions and answers. So let's get started. Section 1 will be about the hormones secreted by the cardiovascular system. We will talk about the names of these hormones as well as what they do, i.e. their function. And please remember that when I am saying cardiovascular system, I am referring to both the heart as well as the blood vessels that connect the heart to the rest of the body. So hormones produced by this system means hormones produced by any type of cell that makes these components. That could be endothelial cells, smooth muscle cells, or, for example, fibroblasts that make up the cardiovascular system. The first hormone which we can see here is the atrial natriuretic peptide, also known as ANP. This hormone is produced by the myocardiocytes of the atria of the heart. Another similar hormone is called brain natriuretic peptide, also known as BNP. That one is produced by the myocardiocytes of the ventricles of the heart. Both of these hormones have the same function and they're produced in the same situation. That is when the heart is overfilled with blood. This can happen when the heart is not able to pump the blood forward strongly enough, causing accumulation of blood behind the aorta, and also when, for example, there is overhydration and therefore hypervolemia, or, for example, when there is a very high metabolic state, and then that means that the body is trying to compensate for the high metabolic state by increasing cardiac output, which may involve increasing the amount of volume of blood inside the circulation. So when the heart notices that there is too much blood inside its chambers, and then the atria and the ventricles are stretched, increased stretching of the myocardiocytes stimulates increased production and increased secretion of these two hormones. The goal is to cause increased filtration rate, as you can see in this table, as well as decreased sodium reabsorption. Now, how does ANP and BNP achieve these two functions? The increase in filtration rate is achieved by causing vasodilation of the afferent arterioles. Vasodilation of the afferent arterioles is achieved via ligand binding to receptors called natriuretic peptide receptors A and B. When the afferent arteriole vasodilates, there is more blood flow through it, which means there is more blood flow through the glomeruli, which means there is a high hydrostatic pressure and therefore a higher glomerular filtration rate. The goal of this is to increase the amount of urine produced and therefore decrease the volume of blood inside the vessels and inside the heart to counteract the accumulation of blood inside the heart chambers. At the same time, these peptides have a direct action on epithelial cells on the medullary collecting ducts. They act on receptors found there, and by binding to these receptors, they inhibit sodium channels, which are important in reabsorbing sodium at this part of the glomerulus, and that is how they decrease sodium reabsorption. Again, the goal is to decrease the intravascular volume. Decrease in sodium reabsorption means decrease in water reabsorption and therefore decrease in the intravascular volume to counteract the overfilling of the heart. Now let's move on to the endothelins. Endothelin 1, 2 and 3 are the main ones which you find in humans. These are peptides which are produced by endothelial cells of all blood vessels across the cardiovascular system. Their function is vasoconstriction. They achieve this by binding to endothelin receptors found on smooth muscle cells of mainly arterioles. When they bind to these receptors, there is contraction of the smooth muscle cell and therefore arteriolar vasoconstriction. They also increase the production of nitric oxide via stimulating endothelial cells to produce nitric oxide, again through endothelin receptors, and then stimulating the nitric oxide production by the endothelial cells. Now you may ask, since nitric oxide is a vasodilatory compound, why would endothelins which have a vasoconstrictory function want to produce nitric oxide? Won't that counteract their vasoconstrictory effect? And the answer is yes. And in fact, they do want to counteract this effect so as to not over vasoconstrict, so as to have vasoconstriction but not excessive one. So the nitric oxide that they stimulate the production of helps to cause a more balanced and not excessive vasoconstriction. Finally, let's go on to nitric oxide. This is a compound that is produced by endothelial cells of all blood vessels across the cardiovascular system. There are two important enzymes which you need to know when it comes to nitric oxide produced by the cardiovascular system. That is the endothelial nitric oxide synthase as well as the inducible nitric oxide synthase. The former is constitutively active and produces nitric oxide at all times. The latter is an enzyme that is stimulated during conditions of inflammation by various cytokines produced during the inflammation. And as the former produces nitric oxide all the time, the latter produces nitric oxide when it is induced, because in those situations you need extra nitric oxide because you need extra vasodilation. The way that nitric oxide has its functions is through binding to an intracellular enzyme, intracytoplasmic enzyme mainly, called guanylate cyclase. Then there is production of various second molecules, which I will not go into much detail because this is mainly biochemistry and we will try to focus on the physiology principles, but those are things that are important for you to learn. So do learn the pathway for nitric oxide production and how it brings about its effects. But essentially the end result is that by activation of guanylate cyclase, you decrease the concentration of calcium ions in the cytoplasm, and this correlates with decreased contraction of smooth muscle cells in arterioles and therefore vasodilation of the arterioles. Now let's move on to part number 2, the hormones that act on the cardiovascular system. The first hormone, which you can see here, is angiotensin II. We will talk about how angiotensin II is produced and more details about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system later on when we will be discussing heart failure. Now we will focus just on the function of angiotensin II, and that, as you can see, is vasoconstriction, mainly of arterioles. This is achieved by angiotensin II binding on angiotensin II receptors found on smooth muscle cells of arterioles, causing their contraction, causing arteriolar vasoconstriction. Arginine Vasopressin is another peptide hormone which is also known as ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Its function is to cause vasoconstriction when it comes to the cardiovascular system. It does this by binding to V1 receptors on smooth muscle cells of arterioles, causing them to contract, causing arteriolar vasoconstriction. Catecholamines are neurotransmitters produced from the amino acid tyrosine, and they either cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation depending on which vascular bed we're talking about. And the difference is actually based on the receptors found in these different types of vascular beds. The main catecholamine that is concerned with the cardiovascular system, specifically with the vessels, as we're talking about here, vasoconstriction, vasodilation, is noradrenaline. Noradrenaline can cause vasoconstriction by binding to alpha-1 adrenergic receptors. The vasodilation is caused by noradrenaline binding to beta-2 adrenergic receptors. For example, when you are running, when you're exercising that is, you want to redirect your blood to your heart, to your lungs, to your brain, to coordinate the running movement, and of course to your skeletal muscles. You don't particularly care about providing a lot of blood to your gastrointestinal system, for example, or to the ends of your toes or the ends of your fingers. Therefore, in the latter cases, that is where you want vasoconstriction to happen. And in the former scenarios, in the former blood vessels, that is where you want vasodilation to occur. For example, in the skeletal muscle, you want vasodilation so that there is more blood going to the skeletal muscle, more oxygen, more glucose to facilitate the exercise motion. Therefore, you have to remember the conclusion that you have to take from this example is that the same hormone, the same ligand, can cause a different result, let's say, depending on the receptor that it binds to. Noradrenaline can cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation depending on whether it binds to alpha-1 or beta-2 receptors. Now let's move on. Let's talk about bradykin and nitric oxide. Nitric oxide we've already talked about. As you can see, this is a small molecule that is both produced by the cardiovascular system and acts on it. Again, it causes vasodilation. And bradykinin is another peptide, this time hormone, which causes vasodilation. The mechanism is by binding to bradykinin receptors or smooth muscle cells of arterioles, causing them to relax, causing arterial vasodilation. Finally, we move on to thromboxanes. These are lipid type of molecules which cause vasoconstriction. They are produced by mainly platelets and they bind on thromboxane receptors, as they are called, on smooth muscle cells, blah blah blah, as you already know. Even though there are different types of receptors that can lead to vasoconstriction and different types of receptors that can lead to vasodilation, the end result that brings about the relaxation or contraction is basically the same. When you want to cause vasoconstriction, you want to essentially increase the calcium concentration inside the cytoplasm of smooth muscle cells. When you want to cause vasodilation, you want to decrease the calcium concentration inside the cytoplasm of various smooth muscle cells. And there are different receptors with their corresponding second messengers and their corresponding ligands that can achieve that. Now let's move on to the hormones which are secreted by the kidneys. The first hormone which you can see here is renin. This is in fact an enzyme. It is produced by the juxtaglomerular cells of the kidney. These cells are modified smooth muscle cells and they are found in this wall of the afferent and afferent arterioles. Renin's function is to increase the activity of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, the details of which we will talk later on, as we said previously, when we talk about heart failure. Now, number 2 is prostaglandins. These are lipid molecules like thromboxanes, and their function on the kidney is to decrease sodium reabsorption. The way that they do this is by binding to their specific receptors on the epithelial cells of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. And by binding to these receptors, they inhibit a specific transporter called the sodium-potassium chloride transporter, which functions to reabsorb sodium. So you inhibit the transporter, you inhibit its function, you decrease sodium reabsorption. This could be, for example, important in states of hypernatremia. Erythropoietin is the third hormone we have here, and it functions to increase erythrocyte production by activating certain progenitor cells along the erythropoietic pathway found in the bone marrow. It binds to certain receptors on these specific cells along the erythropoietic pathway, and it stimulates their growth or their differentiation or both, depending on which cell we're talking about. Then finally we have 1,25 dihydroxy vitamin D, also known as cholecalciferol, which is the activated form of vitamin D, and its function is to help in calcium homeostasis. I will not talk in details about this as we have chapter 5, which talks about the parathyroid glands and this hormone specifically, and it will be presented in detail in a separate endocrinology presentation. Now we move on to point number 4, which are the hormones which act on the kidney. The first hormone which you see here is aldosterone. This is a steroid hormone produced by the cells of the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. Its function is to increase sodium reabsorption. The way it does this is by acting on the principal cells found in the distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubules, and collecting ducts of the kidney. Specifically, aldosterone binds to its intracellular intracytoplasmic receptor, forming a ligand receptor complex that then relocates itself to the nucleus, increasing transcription of certain proteins. These proteins are a sodium channel, a potassium channel, and the sodium-potassium pump. The increased amount of these channels then incorporate themselves into specific parts of the principal cell. The sodium channels and the potassium channels incorporate themselves into the apical membrane of the principal cells, while the sodium-potassium pump incorporates itself into the basolateral membrane of the principal cells. The way that this whole system functions is that by having more sodium-potassium pumps, we have more pumping of sodium channels out of the principal cells, decreasing the intracellular concentration of sodium ions. This encourages sodium ions to move from the intratubular space, i.e. the urine inside the lumen of the tubules, into the cytoplasm of the principal cells, and then into the interstitium and the blood that is leaving the kidney to be going around the body, and basically for this sodium to stay inside the blood and stay inside the body instead of being excreted from the body in urine. And that is how we achieve an increased sodium reabsorption through aldosterone. Then the second hormone we have here is arginine vasopressin. This is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, that also acts on the principal cells of the same sections of the kidney as mentioned for aldosterone. This time though vasopressin binds to a different receptor. This is called vasopressin 2 receptor. Its function is to increase the movement of aquaporins number 2, which are already produced and localized in certain vacuoles inside the cytoplasm of the cells into the basolateral membrane of the principal cells. Aquaporin channel type 1 are already embedded in the apical membrane. So when there is this pairing of aquaporin 1 and aquaporin 2 on the apical and the basolateral membrane respectively, free water can be reabsorbed through the distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubules, and collecting ducts in the kidney under the influence of increased vasopressin production and release. Then we have catecholamines. As you can see here, catecholamines have many effects on the kidneys. One example that I would like to mention is the increased production of renin. This is done by noradrenaline acting on the juxtaglomerular cells via beta-2 adrenergic receptors, stimulating the production and release of renin so as to increase the activity of the RAAS system. Then we have vitamin D, the activated form, which we have seen is actually produced by the kidney, and now we see that it is also functioning on the kidney. More details on this you will find on the equivalent endocrinology chapter. We have reached the end of this video. In it we discussed points 1 through 4 from our chapter objectives, that is the names and the actions of the hormones acting on the cardiovascular system in the kidney. On the second video, which is part 2 of endocrinology chapter 8, we will be discussing points 5 and 6. That means heart failure and the ways that all these hormones that we discuss are cooperating with each other and acting on the cardiovascular system in the kidney in order to compensate for the failing heart. And then we will be discussing some questions and their answers so that you can better grasp these concepts, and hopefully that will help you have a very well-rounded idea of these very, very important topics that we're covering here.